Hey everybody, welcome to Component Hierarchies. I hope by the end of this lesson you will be able to break down a design into components. So let's talk a little bit about what components are. So if you think about, here, let's just go to some web page. Maybe, let's go to Google. So some things that could be, actually, I want to see if this feature works. If I do .com in here. Oh shoot, I had this figured out the other day where I could clip this out and draw on it. Yep, there we go. Capture window. Add to current page. Perfect. So if I'm trying to figure out what the components are on this page, like really all of these could be components. We could, this logo, that could be a component. This input box is definitely a component. Both of these buttons could be components. This little link right there. This entire footer down at the bottom, likely a component. And this is probably not the case on this one, but could be. We could also make components out of each of those links. I would say this entire header is probably also a component. This part of it might be a component as well as the things inside of it. Same with that, and that, and that. All of those could be components. Now, we could go less granular than that. We could say the header is one component, the footer is one component, the search bar with the logo is a component, and then everything below that is a component also. We could also do that. And it's not too terribly difficult to drill up or down in either direction, to break something down or like coalesce it together. But even before we start talking about how we move state and props and behavior and all that kind of shit around, like what are the like indivisible pieces of the interface? Those are components. You have some flexibility on what indivisible is, but that's kind of our general idea with a component. And then if this is in an app, the entire app is probably a component also. And so the fact that we have an app component that has a header component inside of it, that has link components inside of it, that's a component hierarchy. That's what we mean by that word. Ask me some questions about that.
I think one of the biggest questions that I've had is knowing when to use this dot state as you start to kind of get deeper into that structure, you know, 2 or 7 different components.
Sure. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. The short answer is, well, shit, I don't know if there's a short answer for that. We'll talk about it more later, promise.
Cool. Thanks,
But just this idea of Not even thinking about like the cool behavior that you might do with it. If you were just going to try to build a user interface, if this is just raw HTML and we're just using these things like Legos, any questions about that as a concept?
I guess with all this, you're saying that each one of these can potentially be a component.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say a component hierarchy, the way I see that is just like a main component that everything kind of goes into. Is that kind of the way I should be looking at that?
And then it keeps going down. So this red square, that's the one big component that everything goes into. But then it has like this footer component inside of it that also has these link components inside of it. And so that just keeps going all the way down.
So essentially they're nested within each other.
Yes, that. If we were going to represent this, not so visually, like you might have that footer could be, okay, we got 3 links there, we have 3 links there, 3 links there. So the fact that those are grouped together probably means that they have some component that groups them, and then all together they're a component. One of several, so there's like another one there and another one there that are in this outer component. So when we end up writing this in code, we don't see like on the right and on the left and any of that kind of stuff. We see which components live together and which components are they inside of. That's a component hierarchy.
Got it. Thank you.
Other questions about this?
I guess when you're determining if it needs to be its own component or if it, like the footer, for example,
Mhm.
if you're whether you need all those separate things to be their own components or all just part of the footer, like is there a certain threshold or when would you determine that?
It's a great question. If this is like interpretive, so the answer that I'm going to give you is probably not what every other like React dev would give you. I like to break it down to the point where I can think of these as Legos rather than HTML elements. So this footer, for example, might end up looking something like, okay, so I have an app component on the outside. And inside of that, I have this footer component. Then I might have a link group that has a link. There's 3 links there and 3 links there. So, and just to put a real fine point on it, the thing that I just did, this is this bottom thing. All 3 of those are we're talking about the same thing with all those. I really like component hierarchies that look like this. Abstracts away the HTML elements, allows me to think about this more in terms of like, how is my app structured? There are other people that would go, that is way too granular. You just end up with a bunch of files. It gets hard to see what the big picture is because you spend so much time in these like smaller pieces of it. And so at another end of this, you could probably say something like, no, that's too much. What I would do instead is definitely not the individual links, probably not the groups either. You still need those elements to do it this way, but no, fuck it. Just have those be regular old HTML anchor tags. Make these divs. Use the like regular HTML footer semantic tag. No, just do it like that, man. Why are you making this so complicated? So there's a spectrum of like what should be a component that goes from like this to this. You'll probably develop opinions on this pretty quickly. But as for myself, there's no trouble with making things, making your components very small. And I think it makes your app easier to understand. So I tend to.
Is it correct to say that a component should ideally just do one thing?
Yep. There's also like what you'll see people talk about with components more than anything is reusability. These links are good examples of that. The link groups are too, where we go, oh man, it's so nice to just write this component and then I can just reuse that component over and over again. All that's true. That's half the benefit. The other half of the benefit, I think, is encapsulation. We're using that in a different sense than the OOP kind of encapsulation. We're using this as like, keep a bunch of things together. So even though this footer is never going to get reused anywhere else in the app, having all the stuff with the footer in one place, I think makes that a little bit easier to follow. Because in practice, you don't actually see it look like this. What you actually see, and this is what like the people who don't like this style don't like about it, is you see a bunch of different things. So really what you'd see is just footer. And then you go into the footer file. And what you see is two link groups. Like that. And then in those link groups, you see something like iterating over a link in like in a loop. And then in your link, that's where like the actual anchor tag is. And so all of these are different files. They're encapsulated together. This would like all be in one file. Some trade-offs.
This is actually something I debate pretty often when I work with React apps. How far should you break things down? Like, when does it become less convenient and like having things, I guess, each component pure to what they're supposed to be, and it just being excessive?
I've never seen something with too many components before. I don't think it's possible. But like the answer was in your question. Like, when is it inconvenient? So if like you could do something like this all in one file, super convenient. I think it hurts readability a little bit. Definitely hurts reusability, but like nothing's necessarily being reused at all in this footer. So why fuss about it? I like just being able to say footer, and then we're kind of done. And then if I look in that footer file, all right, well, it's got these two link groups. I look in a link group and I just see I'm iterating over these links. I don't mind going between the different files, especially when at the app level, I can just go, oh, the footer's there. If I don't need to fuck with the footer, then I can focus on every other thing that's in this component. And it doesn't have quite so much noise in it. Because I find that people that do more of this kind of thing end up with 150, 300 line component files, and it gets hard to find anything in there. I'd way rather have a ton of 15 line files.
So does that kind of go back to keeping the app.js as like a navigator instead of actual content?
Yep. Same kind of idea. Other questions about how we can make these hierarchies? All right, so what I want you to do now is I want you to go to the New York Times website. And I want you to spend some time figuring out what in this you can make components out of. Look for things that show up a bunch of times. For example, this thing here, it's got a title, it's got a little subtitle, it's got an image. Why? That's exactly what's happening here. Why? That's exactly what's happening here. So that's probably a reusable component. Same thing with this. It's got a little title there, a couple of bullets. It's probably a component. This entire thing got a headline, got an image. Well, I'm just doing it for you at this point. So let's take a couple minutes, figure out which components you see on this. Go. All right, let's talk about this a little bit. So I did this on a different angle. I want you to think of which ones you struggled with, which ones were not immediately obvious, whether or not they should be components.
Not the menu button at the top right. There, with the search bar, but after you click it, I wasn't sure if
That,
the information inside of it.
all this stuff?
Yeah.
Ah, excellent. So if I were doing this, I would say that this button is a component. I would say that this entire sidebar that flew out is a component. I would say that each of these items is a component, and you can configure a component too. So you can say like, all right, has children equals true. And so if that's the case, it should maybe have this little arrow on the side and have that hover action. I would say that this entire thing is probably also a component. It's got that little caret over to the left of it. And then, probably not components for the actual links, although I could be talked into it. That's going a little far though.
So is essentially everything a component?
Hell yeah, baby. Could be.
Because components are just like node elements, or
Yes. Like this is the easiest way to think of a component. It's a custom DOM element. So if you think about what we can do with DOM elements, we've got ones like H1. It takes in some text. And makes it look big. Well, so your browser does with it. Semantically, you're saying like, all right, this is the most important thing on the page. Okay, that's one kind of like DOM element we have. We also have like fairly complicated ones. Like we have input. Input, you can type into it and its value changes. That's a state change. So we have components that keep track of state. All right. Well, we can also have DOM elements that have other DOM elements inside of them. We add event listeners to this. We can read the inputs of these. That's also a DOM element. A component is just like all of these, all three of them, except it can be whatever you want it to be. You can customize the behavior. Custom DOM element, that's what a component is.
Hey Kyle, did you say the state is for like when something will change?
Yep. So if you have an input, its value state starts as an empty string. And if you type F, the state of it changes to F. And if you type an A, the state of it changes to FA. What else did you struggle with componentizing on this?
I think for me on that header, the date itself would probably be a component, but it doesn't really strike that immediately.
So here's, I think, a strong argument for making this a component. So what you could do is you could make that component responsible for getting the current date itself. That's not how I would do it, but I think a lot of people would. And so I think you could have a date element, and whenever you put that on the page, it looks up what the date is and slaps that up there.
I guess the same could be said for the for the weather on the other side as well, right?
Exactly. Especially since, and like this stock ticker, see how it like changes? It's like rotating through a few things. Definitely a component.
Oh, do you think that would be like a container with the stocks as separate components that it rotates through, or no?
It could be. I probably wouldn't do it that way. What I would do is have an array of all of these things and then iterate through the array, just showing the next one. But I have one component with an array of whatever stocks it's showing. These are indexes.
Would you make the live updates one component, similar to like the S&P 500 index, like where it's just rotating through each live update as it comes through?
Potentially. So yeah, if this is something where like these fall off and show up, yeah, make this entire thing one component. Because here's part of the power of this. Then you can start thinking of just this live updates thing as an app. It's turtles all the way down, man. Like the components are self-similar. All these squares are kind of the same thing. We just go smaller and smaller and smaller and bigger and bigger and bigger. You can zoom in and zoom out. They all kind of have the same shape. So if this was like somebody's Mod 3 project or Mod 4 project or something, that could be an app. Also, we can integrate it into a bunch of other things like that. That's part of the power of components.
So what about something like the Twitter news feed? Because to me, it seems very similar to the live updates.
Yeah. Totally. So if you have something like Twitter live feed, and what this does is it looks up data and puts those into tweet components. Like that. And maybe these break down even further than that. You have something like the content of the tweet. Well, you got to know when it's going to truncate the content or not. And so there's a question earlier about like components should only be responsible for one thing. I think that's a good example of like the tweet shouldn't be responsible for displaying the picture and the links and knowing when to truncate the list of this thing and whatever else. I think it makes more sense for the tweet component's only job to be to combine together all these other things. That's its one responsibility. Figuring out when the text of a tweet gets truncated, well, there's like a tweet text component for that. And then this Twitter live feed component's job is to go fetch data, and then for every array of data that it gets back, it renders a new tweet component. I think that's savvy. Other things you struggled with on componentizing this?
I think my biggest thing was whether or not the sections were its components, or like you just said, like the image, the title, the information inside. if each of those are its own components, or if as a whole, like the pandemic, delivers, image, bullet are all one type component.
So I would probably, this is nytimes.com. So on this, I would probably say that the entire thing is definitely a component. You could make a pretty good argument for like these things each being either each being individual components, but probably for sure being at least wrapped in something. I probably wouldn't make the headline a component. I might split this this left side and the image, like make all of that a component and then otherwise have that in there. And so then the hierarchy of this ends up looking like lead story. That might be the name of the component. And so then lead story.js, the JSX in that is article, lowercase a. And then it might be something like story highlights. And that image. And then story highlights might have section with a H1, maybe an H2, something like that. So whatever the thing is, and we can make that a variable. And then maybe it's got children that are something like story points. I don't know if I love these names, but so inside that, that's a UL. And for every UL in there, you could say that like each one of those is a story point. I think it's fair. Or you can say something like content or something in there. And then iterate through that, iterate through the story points. And so then like in your app or whatever, all of this is just lead story. Well, lead story is made up of highlights and an image. And the highlights are a headline and these story points. And the story points are a list of list items. And so then to lead into this like next part, lead story then needs all that data. So it needs something like headline equals pandemic delivers triple punch. And then the other data we need in this would be something like story points are an array of things that are like content hit hard by job losses. And so we can use that to just keep going all the way down to this hierarchy. And story highlights ends up getting that headline also, except it's going to be props.headline. And this is going to be props.headline. And then story points. So the story highlights also needs that the story points thing. So they say story points is props.storypoints. Over here, maybe we just, since we're iterating through that, do something like props.storypoints.map story point oops, never mind. Go back. This should go here. Every story point should return an LI with storypoint.content. So yeah, if we were coding this out, it would probably look something like this. I would also need an image URL. And this would be there you go. Just coded it. But the cool thing is then this is what we end up seeing at our app level. So it gives us the right level of abstraction to work with. And then we can break that down as much as we want. Questions about that?
I got a real day one question about the naming conventions. The story points, props, so on and so forth. Is that all, I guess that could be whatever variable you want it to be. And you're just keeping it in line with whatever the key is just for what purpose? Just easier on yourself to remember, to use that way?
Sure. So components, actually, I don't like this, but whatever, they didn't ask me. Same naming convention as classes, and they're pretty close. So this is called Pascal case. Starts with first letters capital, every word in it is capital also. Everything else, we use regular JS conventions. We camel case. First letters lower, this is whatever. So if I see this, that's a hint to me that I'm working with a component of story points. If I see this, this lets me know that I'm working with story points as data. That's an array, that's a component.
And props is being imported from another JS file. I mean, the React JS or
basically. So it's like a preview for your state and props lesson. If I have a component out here and a component in here, and I have something out here and I pass it in, it does that through props. So, and this doesn't have to be state, it often is. Props is usually just somebody else's state. But when we're talking about passing something into a component, props is a list of things that were passed into you. And that's auto magic React stuff. There, I'll show you. Create React app. And it's not any more complicated than this. It really isn't. I think that when you're starting in on React, it's really easy to overcomplicate this state and props idea. Props is just the stuff you were given. So over here, lead story needs the headline. It needs to give it to this because it ends up getting used here. This is 4 levels of hierarchy that we're nesting through. So if we have something out here that needs to get in, we pass it in as props. So here, they're not state. I just hard-coded them in, but they could have come from state. In this lead story component, the way I get access to that headline is props.headline because I got past it. This is props.headline, props.storypoints, props.image URL. Whatever you got passed, that shows up to you in an object that by convention is called props.
All right, so I'm going to try to rephrase my question a little bit.
Good.
So, so story highlights where you have headline equals props.headline. The props.headline, that headline is what you're getting from the props that were passed down.
Yes.
The headline in front of the equals sign.
Yes.
That is just a random variable that you named whatever you wanted.
Correct.
Okay, so you can use that to be monkey equals props.headline.
And then this would be, so if I changed that to be fart, then this one is fart because that's what this one was given.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all it is.
Gotcha.
This is a side, not serious question, but have you ever written fart on a variable in a professional project of yours?
I don't think so. Probably will one of these days. I've done some bad shit in production apps, but I don't think that's one of them. All right, let's take a look at an actual real life React app. All right, so I get all this stuff. Don't want it. Don't need it. All right, and then so this is going to be my outer component. I'm going to call it outer. Also going to make one called inner. And we're going to be able to use that right there. So if I wanted to pass something in, I could say this will be inner's props. And then this is going to get props. Say this will also be inner's props. Cool. So in this one, yeah, I'll do p tags. I could say something like props dot this will be inner props. Props. This will also be inner props. And then if I run this app,
I think they were. This will also be inner props.
what was that?
They both were this.
Oh, I
will.
did. It's gonna be girl.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. Practice. Demo. There you go. That's hierarchies. That's how we pass stuff around. Where this gets complicated is that we can pass in strings and booleans and what have you like this. We can also pass in components. We can pass in functions. We can pass in all sorts of different shit. That's where this gets complicated. But this props idea is the same regardless. You put something here, it's available as props in whatever you pass it into.
Is there always like a one over encompassing app file? So like on the New York Times, can lead story start, or does it have to go to like an app, or is there a parent?
Yeah, it's there doesn't have to be a top level component. If every single app you do for the rest of your time at Flatiron has one, I would say that's pretty normal. The time when you wouldn't have like one overarching top level component is if it's not a React app, it's a website that's using React. Then you might not have one big overarching one. But even then, it's just one overarching smaller one. But ultimately, these get mounted somewhere. So this is looking for some HTML element with the ID of root. Hey, what do you know? And so the entire app ends up going inside of this. More questions about hierarchy? One last thing. This will like tee you up pretty well for state and props. So I hard coded this stuff in there. I don't have to though. I could make those variables. Still works. And then I can also make those state. I could do that by making that a class, wrapping this in a render method. Putting these in a state object. And then saying this dot state dot hey, this dot state dot girl, and we're back in business. Same thing. Nothing on inner had to change. This is part of the reason that we split this stuff up. I don't give a shit where this came from. You could have hard-coded it. You could have used it as a variable. It could have come from state. It's not my business. I don't care. Just tell me what I got. And in that way, that allows you to start thinking about this as smaller and smaller and smaller problems. This live updates thing, that's its own problem. The little things inside of it, who cares? They don't have to worry about where their data came from, just what it is. Something needs to worry about where that data came from, but that thing isn't directly responsible for how it ends up getting rendered. Can make somewhere else in the hierarchy worry about that. Like that. Any other hierarchy questions? All right, so the assessment for this one, I'm especially proud of. I'd recommend giving it a shot. Shoot. No.
Seconded. It's great.
So so what I did is I took the Google homepage. So it's this, except I just gave you raw HTML for it. If you go to the app.js on this one, that is the entire Google homepage, just as pure HTML. And then all this data. So that's kind of like a fetch request or something. So you use it a little bit. Let's see. So things like these links, the little Flatiron sidebar about like how many search results were there and what's the URL and all these kinds of things. They're hard coded in here, but check this shit out. This is what would come back from an API for something like that. So that's all those things represented as data. So the first thing that you want to do is see if you can replace all of the hard-coded stuff here with the data from that file. It's already coming in. It's already in state. So if you do this dot state dot search result counter, whatever the thing is, you should be able to just swap out that number for whatever comes back from for your state right now. And then try breaking this out into components. Can you make a deep link component that takes in this state in here and passes it in? You have things like these app cards. Can you iterate over whatever is being displayed here? Like these all look like tweets. Can you iterate over all that data? Can you find where it comes back from the API? Make those all show up? This is a pretty good one. If you get through this one, I think you're in a pretty good track with React stuff. Cool. Have a good lunch.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle.